part is known as a clause or a block, or you can call it an if block. So this if block is like a body. It's like when you write an essay, you have the introduction, then you have the body, then you have the conclusion. Likewise, for this if conditional or this if construct, you have the body. Inside this body you can include as many statements as you want. I've just included a single statement that simply prints out a message to the command prompt. You can even print out a second message like this. So you can, this is just for the demonstration purpose. So I want to show you that you can include as many statements as you want or as it is required. So I'm not going to include another statement. Now the interesting part in here is the else clause. Now the else clause is not like the typical if clause. It is a little different than the if clause. Why? Because the first thing you notice in here is that it uses the else keyword followed by the curly brace, which means this else keyword is followed by its own body or its own clause, or it is only using an else block without a condition. So you don't see any sort of condition in here. Why? Because the else clause is the default clause. Because if your if condition fails, or if the condition in here is false, then your compiler is going to skip this highlighted part, or your compiler is going to skip the if clause and it's going to move on to the else clause. So whatever is in the else clause, it's going to print out that statement inside this else block on your command prompt. So we get a message that says they are not equal. So where do we find that statement? We find that statement inside, or we find that message inside this else clause. Now the else clause is actually being triggered because the if condition is false in this context. Why is it false? Because the first number variable contains a value of 1 and the second number variable contains a value of 2. So 1 is equals to 2. That doesn't make sense. Obviously, in any simple terms, in any common sense, or in any computational sense, it makes complete no sense. So in our human terms, we say that it does not make sense, but in computing terms, you don't say it doesn't make sense. It has a special way of telling that. So it's going to say it is false. So as I said before, your condition is going to be evaluated to a Boolean expression. So likewise, a Boolean expression can either be false or true, because your if condition must always be true in order for this clause, this if clause, or this if block to be executed. This condition must always be true, and because in this context it's not true, that's why your compiler, or my compiler perhaps, is actually ignoring this clause, this if clause, and it's triggering or using the else clause. So when it encounters an else clause, it's going to print out whatever is included inside this else block. But what happens if you just change the value from 2 to 1 inside this second number variable? So what I've done in here is that I have assigned 1 to second number variable. So let's save this. Let's get back to the command prompt. Let's clear all this stuff. Let's recompile this entire script, and then we can run this script or run the executable that it has produced. Now you see a different thing. Previously you have seen a message that said they are not equal. Now you see something like they are equal. So where do you find that statement? Or where do you find that message? You find that message inside the if clause. Why do you see that message? Because the first number variable contains the value of 1 and the second number variable contains the value of 1. So when your compiler sees that 1 is equals to 1, which means your condition is true, so it's going to execute whatever is inside this if clause or whatever is inside this if block. So it has got only one single statement, and it's executing that statement, and that's why we see that message. And if this condition is true, which is true in our context right now, it's going to ignore this else clause. That's why we don't see this message, they are not equal, being printed out on our browser. So we learn something essential from this. So if the if clause is executed, the else clause is ignored. But if the if clause is ignored, your else clause will be executed. Let me say that again, or let me actually repeat that again. If your if clause is executed, your else clause will be ignored by the compiler. But if your if clause is ignored, your else clause will be executed by the compiler.